For decades, the name Eamonn Holmes was synonymous with a very specific kind of British broadcasting stability. To understand the collapse of his public image and his long-term marriage, one must first look at the foundation upon which his entire adult identity was constructed. He was not a creature of modern reality television or overnight internet fame. Rather, he was a product of a disciplined, traditional era of journalism. Born into the working-class realities of Belfast, his early life was shaped by structural order, attending Holy Family Primary School and later St. Malachy's College. These institutions instilled a deep-seated respect for routine hard work and a sense of duty that would eventually define his on-screen persona. He did not seek out the limelight through theatrical antics, but through sheer unyielding reliability, a trait that became his ultimate professional currency. When he entered the broadcasting world at Ulster Television in the late 1970s, it was through the unglamorous lens of rural journalism on farming Ulster. This was not a platform for vanity but a masterclass in factual reporting and connecting with everyday people, laying the groundwork for a legendary career. By the time the early 1980s arrived, his steady presence had earned him a significant promotion to anchor Good Evening Ulster, stepping into a massive vacancy left by Gloria Honeyford. This transition was monumental because it forced him to step beyond the safety of reading scripts and into the vulnerable position of setting a nightly cultural tone. It was here that he mastered the art of live television, a medium that punishes hesitation and rewards authentic composure under immense pressure. His trajectory caught the attention of national networks, leading to his pivotal role in launching the historic first broadcast of GMTV in the early 1990s. Breakfast television is notoriously brutal, demanding an impossible combination of razor-sharp journalistic alertness before dawn and a comforting warmth before the public has even had their morning coffee. Holmes did not just survive this demanding environment, he absolutely thrived within it, becoming a household fixture whom millions trusted implicitly. This trust became an invisible contract between him and the viewing public, a bond built on the promise that no matter how chaotic the news became, he would remain steady. Even when behind-the-scenes friction became public knowledge, such as his highly publicized fallout with co-host Anthea Turner, Holmes managed to emerge without losing his professional footing. Instead of leaving the network in a cloud of disgrace, he remained grounded, demonstrating a resilient professionalism that kept the audience on his side throughout the corporate storm. When he did eventually choose to depart GMTV, he refused to slip away into the shadows quietly, choosing instead to voice a sharp critique of daytime television's shifting landscape. He openly lamented the industry's departure from serious, hard-hitting news coverage toward a shallow, celebrity-driven culture, a critique that cemented his reputation for uncompromising honesty. This blunt, unfiltered integrity became his defining trademark, following him directly to Sky News, where he was brought in to spearhead their flagship morning program, Sunrise. Once again, he found a comfortable, authoritative rhythm in the early hours of the morning, proving that his appeal transcended specific networks or superficial formats. Over the next decade, his portfolio expanded massively, spanning high-stakes quiz shows, live sports coverage, religious programming like Songs of Praise, and extensive talk radio slots. He never seemed to actively chase prestigious, award-winning artistic roles. Instead, he chased the rare and difficult art of absolute, unwavering consistency. By the time he began regularly sharing a broadcasting sofa with Ruth Langsford, he possessed decades of hard-earned mainstream credibility that few in the industry could match. On the screen, their dynamic appeared entirely organic, projected as an easy, deeply believable partnership that resonated with a massive demographic of viewers. Their natural on-screen chemistry quickly evolved from a pleasant coincidence into a highly lucrative and deeply influential media brand. Together, they successfully fronted a variety of lifestyle and entertainment projects, including gift-wrapped in the insightful documentary series How the Other Half Lives. To the casual viewer sitting at home, what they saw was a picture-perfect portrait of marital comfort, mutual respect, and shared professional ambition. What very few people outside their immediate circle truly understood, however, was how dangerously intertwined their personal lives and professional identities were becoming. The boundary between the private husband and wife and the public television duo was beginning to blur into a single, inseparable entity. The first major tremors in this carefully constructed life began to manifest not in their personal relationship, but within the cold, bureaucratic structures of the television industry. In 2020, Holmes suffered a devastating financial and reputational blow when he lost a high-profile tax tribunal regarding his freelance employment status under the controversial IR35 regulations. Rather than shrinking from the public scrutiny that followed the ruling, he fiercely and publicly defended his professional worth, asserting his position as one of the finest live broadcasters in the country. This public defiance was widely misread by critics as a display of arrogance, but in reality, it was an act of survival from a man sensing his control slipping away. The media landscape was rapidly shifting underneath his feet, moving toward younger talent and digital-first formats, making traditional broadcasters feel increasingly vulnerable. Little did the public know that this professional displacement was only the precursor to a much more terrifying battle, one that would take place within his own physical body. The industry he had given his life to was changing its locks, and the physical stamina he relied on to fight back was about to abandon him. To understand the sheer weight of the eventual separation, one must examine how their private love story was systematically transformed into a highly profitable public brand. Eamonn Holmes first met Ruth Langsford in the late 1990s through a mutual industry friend, during a turbulent period when he was navigating the painful separation from his first wife. Because of the delicate nature of his personal life at the time, their romance did not begin under the harsh, invasive glare of paparazzi cameras. Instead, they made a conscious, deliberate choice to keep their relationship entirely hidden from the public eye for several consecutive years. This prolonged privacy was born out of a deep respect for his children and a desire to protect the fragile emotional landscape of his unfolding divorce. Ruth would later reflect on this period with immense fondness, stating that his strict insistence on keeping her secret made her feel incredibly secure rather than hidden away. It proved to her that he valued the substance of their connection far more than the superficial validation of a public debut. They only allowed themselves to step out as a couple once they were entirely certain that their emotional foundation was unbreakable and capable of enduring public scrutiny. In the early 2000s, their bond was further solidified when they welcomed their only child together, a son named Jack, who became the center of their universe. Ruth later shared a poignant memory of discovering her pregnancy the exact day before she was set to attend her godson's emotional christening ceremony. With Eamonn away on a demanding filming assignment, she confided the life-altering news only to her closest friend, keeping the moment beautifully isolated from the media. This was a rare, purely authentic chapter in their lives, far removed from the exhausting machinery of public relations and tabloid headlines. However, by the mid-2000s, the inevitable gravitational pull of their careers began to draw their private world back into the professional sphere. Holmes officially joined Ruth on the Friday edition of ITV's flagship daytime program This Morning, where she had already established her own formidable presenting legacy. Stepping onto that set as romantic partners presented an entirely new set of psychological and professional challenges that most couples would find utterly impossible to navigate. Ruth openly admitted in later years that working alongside her romantic partner was far from an easy, frictionless experience, requiring constant negotiation and emotional restraint. Despite the unspoken friction of sharing a workplace and a home, they managed to craft an on-screen dynamic that resonated deeply with the British public. Over the span of a decade, they grew into daytime television's most dependable, relatable couple, embodying the ideals of enduring domestic partnership. They eventually formalized their long-term commitment by marrying in a lavish, highly publicized ceremony at the historic Elvetham Hall in Hampshire. This milestone was soon followed by the purchase of a magnificent, six-bedroom luxury mansion in the affluent enclave of Weybridge, a property valued at several £1 million. To the outside world, their financial security, professional dominance, and emotional stability appeared to be completely locked in for the rest of their lives. During her highly visible stint on the popular entertainment show Strictly Come Dancing, Ruth frequently described a marriage built entirely on playful teasing and profound mutual understanding. She publicly declared her absolute trust in Eamonn, confidently asserting that he understood the complex inner workings of her mind better than anyone else alive. Yet beneath this glossy veneer of domestic bliss and professional success, dangerous career tremors were quietly beginning to reshape their shared reality. In the final months of 2020, the television industry was rocked by the shocking news that Holmes and Langsford were being abruptly dropped from their regular Friday slot. The sudden decision by network executives to replace them with fresh faces reportedly left both presenters absolutely furious, deeply humiliated, and profoundly unsettled. On a purely professional level, the dismissal stung their pride, but on a deeper personal level, it marked the very first structural divergence in their lives. Ruth remained securely entrenched within the ITV family, continuing her prominent role as a beloved anchor on the highly successful panel show Loose Women. Meanwhile, Holmes made a dramatic, highly controversial leap to the newly launched GB News Network in 2022, eager to spearhead a fiercely independent breakfast program. For the first time in nearly 2 decades of shared history, the couple found themselves completely unaligned on a professional level. They were no longer driving to the same studio, sharing the same green room, or navigating the exact same corporate pressures and political environments. They suddenly belonged to entirely different media ecosystems, operating on vastly different schedules that naturally began to pull their daily routines apart. Outwardly, they maintained a fiercely united front, attending industry events together, and presenting the image of a couple completely unfazed by corporate restructuring. Inwardly, however, the invisible emotional fabric that had bound them together for 30 years was beginning to stretch to its absolute limits. It was during this period of unacknowledged vocational drift that a single, high-stakes career choice would later take on a deeply symbolic significance. During a hectic summer broadcasting break, ITV executives approached the couple with an urgent request to return to This Morning as holiday relief anchors. Ruth's immediate protective maternal instinct was to completely decline the lucrative offer, prioritizing her remaining family time over corporate obligation. She expressed a deep, lingering worry that their teenage son, Jack, might grow up feeling closer to a hired nanny than to his own famous parents. Eamonn's reaction to her hesitation was characteristically blunt, revealing the deep ideological divide that was quietly forming between their worldviews. As a devoted husband and father, he completely validated her emotional concerns, but as a hardened, pragmatic professional voice, he issued a stark, chilling warning. He told her in no uncertain terms that if they turned down this high-profile opportunity, their remaining days on the program would be permanently numbered. Under the immense weight of this professional pragmatism, they ultimately accepted the assignment, returning to the iconic sofa under the watchful eyes of millions. The temporary broadcasting run was an undeniable ratings success, leading to another triumphant return to the program the following summer season. Yet, despite the public accolades, Ruth would later confess in her deeply personal memoir that she felt she never truly had a free choice in the matter. She understood with terrifying clarity how the fickle machinery of modern television operated, knowing that her entire livelihood hung precariously in the balance. This underlying structural tension, the constant agonizing tug-of-war between high-stakes career preservation and peaceful domestic life, did not simply vanish after the cameras stopped rolling. Instead, it settled quietly and permanently beneath the surface of their daily interactions, a silent friction that began to erode their foundation. And just as the professional pressures reached a fever pitch, an even more devastating crisis arrived to shatter their remaining stability. The physical body that had sustained Eamonn Holmes through decades of relentless, pre-dawn broadcasting schedules was about to initiate a catastrophic, agonizing collapse. It was a physical unraveling so severe that no amount of television charisma, professional willpower, or public relations masking could possibly hide it from the world. Part 2: The Anatomy of Collapse. While their carefully managed public image still projected an aura of absolute stability, Eamonn Holmes was secretly entering a dark corridor of profound physical degradation. For several years, an aggressive, invisible tide of chronic pain had been steadily accumulating in the deeper background of his daily life. It was the terrifying kind of physical suffering that begins as a minor, ignorable inconvenience before slowly transforming into a rigid timeline by which you must live. In 2016, this prolonged, exhausting battle with osteoarthritis reached a critical, unavoidable breaking point, forcing him onto the operating table for a double hip replacement. Holmes would later vividly compare the psychological terror of undergoing major orthopedic surgery to the high-wire act of anchoring a live national television broadcast. He noted that the true, paralyzing dread always comes in the quiet moments before the event begins, but once you are inside, choice vanishes entirely. He even attempted to deflect the gravity of the situation by joking publicly about the overwhelming wave of emotional good luck messages he received. He remarked that the deeply sentimental tributes felt as though people were speaking to him with the grim assumption that he might not survive the night. While it sounded like typical self-deprecating Northern Irish humor, it also offered a fleeting, sobering glimpse into a much darker psychological reality. He was acutely aware of how dangerously vulnerable he was about to become, stripped of the physical armor that had protected him for decades. Then in 2018, just as he was beginning to find his footing after the grueling joint surgeries, a new medical emergency ambushed him. This health crisis did not arrive on an ordinary, unremarkable day, but chose to strike on a massive family milestone meant to be purely joyful. On the very morning of his eldest son's long-awaited wedding, Holmes was suddenly struck down by a vicious, agonizing attack of shingles. Within hours, his famous face swelled dramatically, his skin became raw and blistered, and the agonizing nerve pain made even basic movement an unbearable torment. The shocking photographs of his condition, which were later displayed on the panel of Loose Women, left the viewing public deeply unsettled and visibly horrified. They revealed with brutal, unvarnished clarity just how quickly a highly familiar, confidently polished television icon could be rendered completely unrecognizable by sudden illness. The acute phase of the shingles virus eventually passed, but it left behind a permanent, haunting psychological warning in its painful wake. It was a reminder that his physical body was becoming entirely unpredictable, a chaotic variable that could no longer be managed by sheer discipline. And when your entire life is built upon a rigid matrix of television schedules, live cues, and total control, unpredictability becomes its own unique terror. The true irreversible physical decline began in earnest in 2021, when an excruciating, blinding wave of severe back pain arrived without warning. This was not a passing muscle strain, but a chronic, disabling affliction that stubbornly refused to yield to traditional medical intervention. He quickly found himself relying heavily on a walking stick, suddenly trapped inside a cage of physical limitations he could not negotiate his way out of. Medical specialists eventually identified 3 severely slipped discs that were actively compressing his spinal cord, completely cutting off the neurological pathways to his right leg. Heavy treatments like targeted epidural steroid injections brought only fleeting, agonizingly brief moments of physical relief, completely failing to restore his former mobility. Holmes openly admitted to the press that there were frequent, deeply humiliating days where he could no longer walk a single step without assistance. He found himself entirely unable to bend down to tie his own shoes, or perform the most basic acts of personal hygiene without someone else's help. This is the hidden, dark reality of chronic spinal illness that the general public rarely possesses the capacity to fully comprehend from afar. Chronic pain is never just an isolated physical sensation. It is a slow, methodical psychological assault that systematically demolishes your established emotional identity. The effortless physical independence that you took for granted your entire adult life vanishes overnight, replaced by a devastating, soul-crushing dependence. This new reality eats away at your foundational masculine confidence day after day, leaving you feeling like a ghost of your former self. Holmes also spoke with heartbreaking honesty about the profound psychological damage caused by being watched as he struggled through his daily physical torments. He detested the feeling of being viewed with pity, especially by his own adult children, knowing how deeply such a decline alters a home's atmosphere. When the traditionally dominant anchor of a family unit suddenly becomes profoundly fragile, the entire relational architecture surrounding them is forced to change shape. Ruth Langsford was consistently, beautifully supportive in the public eye, using her media presence to champion his resilience and defend his ongoing recovery. By Eamonn's own vulnerable admission, her hands-on assistance became absolutely central to his daily survival during his darkest, most immobile periods. Yet the invisible, crushing weight of long-term caregiving carries a severe psychological toll that few marriages are truly equipped to withstand indefinitely. The longer the chronic illness persists, the harder it becomes for both partners to pretend that the dynamic has not fundamentally altered their love. In September 2022, facing a future of complete immobility, he made the high-stakes decision to undergo complex, highly risky spinal surgery. The delicate operation was meant to be the glorious turning point in his long journey back toward physical independence and professional dominance. Instead, the subsequent recovery process proved to be agonizingly slow, deeply unforgiving, and fraught with unexpected neurological complications. Before he could even begin to rebuild his wasted muscle strength or regain his balance, an absolute catastrophe struck within the walls of his home. Just 2 short weeks after being discharged from the spinal unit, Holmes suffered a horrific accidental fall backwards down 18 steep stairs. He plummeted through the air, completely unable to catch himself, before crashing violently into the solid stone flooring of his entrance hallway below. It was a terrifying, high-impact accident that medical professionals later confirmed could have very easily left him permanently paralyzed or dead. Instead, the violent impact left him with a badly fractured shoulder and catastrophic new damage to a level of mobility that was already under threat. This single devastating accident effectively reset all of his hard-earned surgical progress back to absolute zero, plunging him into a deeper cycle of despair. By the following year, a series of increasingly invasive medical procedures followed, yet his physical world continued to shrink at a terrifying pace. Holmes was forced to publicly admit that he could no longer walk properly, could no longer run, and could do little else besides sit. This was a brutal, soul-destroying reality for a man whose entire legendary career had been built upon being physically active, sharp, and intensely present. A heavy wooden cane became a permanent extension of his arm, and eventually, a specialized wheelchair became an absolute necessity for public outings. In the midst of this unfolding medical tragedy, Ruth continued to speak to the media about maintaining hope for a full recovery. Yet, even in her most optimistic interviews, she began to subtly acknowledge a heartbreaking possibility that had previously been too painful to say out loud. She admitted to reporters that there was a very real, scientifically grounded chance that her husband might never return to 100% health. At the time of the broadcast, her measured words were widely interpreted by fans as an inspiring demonstration of marital strength and realism. In hindsight, however, those same statements sounded less like grounded optimism and more like the profound, quiet exhaustion of a weary caregiver. Long-term, degenerative illness does not simply attack the physical cells of the body. It completely and permanently reshapes the balance of power inside a marriage. The traditionally healthy partner is forced to assume an overwhelming mantle of total domestic and logistical responsibility, transforming into a primary caregiver. Meanwhile, the fiercely independent, unwell partner is reduced to a state of painful, frustrating dependency, an imbalance that creates an unspoken undercurrent of resentment. Even when deep, genuine love remains fully present within the hearts of both individuals, the chronic emotional strain becomes impossible to hide from view. Neither Eamonn nor Ruth needed to state the reality directly to the tabloids for the heavy truth to sit visibly in every room they occupied. When a person's physical independence completely disappears, every single element of their shared life is forced to violently pivot and change along with it. The stage was quietly being set for a final, catastrophic structural collapse that would shock the British public to its absolute core. Part 3: The Parallel Tracks. When the official announcement of their separation was finally delivered to the British press in the spring of 2024, the language used was profoundly clinical. A high-ranking public relations spokesperson issued a brief statement explaining that their respective work commitments had gradually taken them in entirely different geographical directions. The corporate text insisted that they remained deeply committed to maintaining their long-standing friendship, while firmly requesting absolute privacy for their remaining family unit. On the printed page, the dissolution of their partnership sounded incredibly dignified, entirely orderly, and remarkably free of traditional celebrity malice. After nearly 3 full decades of shared life and 14 years of legal marriage, it appeared as though daytime television's favorite couple was concluding their story gracefully. However, carefully managed corporate statements issued by crisis management firms rarely, if ever, tell the true human story behind a marital collapse. Behind the closed doors of their multi-million-pound Surrey mansion, multiple investigative reports began to surface, suggesting a far more sudden, explosive breaking point. According to widely circulated and highly detailed accounts from industry insiders, the final breakdown of the marriage had not been a gradual, peaceful drifting apart. Instead, the decades-long union reportedly suffered a sudden, catastrophic flashpoint from which there was absolutely no possibility of emotional return. The reports alleged that Ruth unexpectedly overheard Eamonn engaged in what was described as a deeply intimate, highly affectionate telephone conversation with another woman. The veteran broadcaster reportedly believed he was entirely alone in his section of the house, completely unaware that his wife was within clear earshot. What she heard unfolding during that private conversation was never detailed explicitly to the press, but insiders described the tone as undeniably personal. The psychological shock of this sudden discovery, according to sources close to the television anchor, was immediate, paralyzing, and deeply devastating. An intense, emotionally charged confrontation immediately followed within the walls of the family home, shattering the remaining illusions of their long-standing domestic stability. The marriage did not technically vanish into thin air overnight, but something fundamental and irreplaceable had been permanently severed within their shared trust. When a foundational bond is cracked in such a public and definitive manner, a relationship can never truly return to its original shape. It limps forward through the remaining weeks, it attempts to negotiate impossible terms, and it waits for the inevitable end to arrive. Weeks after that initial devastating confrontation, additional highly compromising personal messages were allegedly discovered on his personal laptop computer. This second, undeniable digital discovery, according to sources intimately connected to the unfolding situation, completely removed whatever microscopic shred of hope remained. If the initial overheard phone call was a painful structural fracture, these discovered messages served as the definitive, undeniable confirmation of betrayal. Very soon after this final digital revelation, the official public announcement of their legal separation was blasted across every major news outlet. The strategic timing of the announcement only served to intensify the intense wave of media scrutiny that descended upon their separate lives. Within a few short months of the split becoming public knowledge, Eamonn Holmes confirmed he was in a serious relationship with relationship counselor Katie Alexander. The public relations optics of this rapid transition were extraordinarily difficult to manage, triggering a massive wave of negative commentary across social media platforms. Whether this new romantic connection had officially begun before or after the physical separation quickly became entirely secondary to the public's harsh perception. Public sympathy rapidly hardened around Ruth, who chose to remain publicly single, adopting an intensely restrained, deeply dignified posture in her early commentary. But as the long months continued to pass, her carefully measured voice inevitably became the dominant force, shaping the public's psychological understanding of the split. In her highly anticipated, deeply personal memoir titled Feeling Fabulous, she finally laid bare the true, agonizing depth of her emotional trauma. She described the sudden collapse of her marriage as an utterly devastating experience, one that frequently felt completely impossible to survive. She wrote heartbreakingly about starting her dark morning routines by crying uncontrollably in the shower before putting on a brave face for work. She detailed the exhausting process of applying heavy layers of television makeup to masterfully conceal the physical signs of deep emotional exhaustion and sorrow. She admitted to her readers that she felt completely broken on every conceivable level, possessing a broken heart, shattered confidence, and completely ruined dreams. She confessed that she had fully imagined a peaceful, beautiful future alongside him forever, struggling deeply to accept the reality that it was over. Yet as the chapters progressed, she also spoke eloquently about the painful process of radical acceptance serving as her ultimate psychological turning point. She explained to her audience that continuing to fight against the brutal, inevitable reality of her situation was both completely exhausting and entirely pointless. The single hardest part of the entire ordeal, she explained, was being forced to navigate the agonizing breakup under the relentless glare of public scrutiny. Every sensationalized tabloid headline, every cruel online comment, and every piece of wild media speculation added immense weight to an already unbearable emotional burden. Crucially, the words she chose to print within her memoir were never explicitly angry, bitter, or vindictive toward her former partner. They were meticulously controlled, deeply reflective, and heavily wrapped in a sense of profound, self-protective dignity that resonated powerfully with her demographic. This specific, highly refined tone mattered immensely, successfully positioning her in the public consciousness as a deeply wounded but fiercely resilient survivor. And because Eamonn chose to remain completely silent during this highly volatile media period, her specific framing of the divorce solidified permanently. For several consecutive months, he did not issue a single counter-narrative, challenge her emotional timeline, or offer his own perspective on the collapse. In the high-stakes world of public relations, total silence can occasionally be a highly strategic choice, but it can also be dangerous. In the absence of a dual narrative, the public naturally interpreted his ongoing silence as a tacit admission of guilt and profound personal shame. What his complete withdrawal from the media conversation undeniably did was create a massive, highly toxic psychological vacuum around the true narrative. And within that empty space, only one highly polished, deeply sympathetic version of the tragic events was allowed to exist for the public. That status quo remained completely unchallenged until very recently, when the veteran broadcaster finally began to speak out in his own unique way. When he did choose to break his long silence, he did not launch into a series of angry, defensive counteraccusations against his former wife. He did not attempt to dispute the reality of her profound pain, nor did he offer a series of petty excuses for his behavior. Instead, he spoke with a quiet, heavy vulnerability about the concept of profound life imbalance and the deep regrets that haunt his later years. In a revealing, highly somber interview, he admitted that if he possessed the magical power to change one single thing about his past, it would be his balance between career and family. He did not elaborate dramatically on the specific mistakes he had made, allowing the understated regret to carry its own immense, crushing weight. He openly acknowledged that for several decades, he had systematically prioritized his broadcasting career, his contractual obligations, and his financial survival above all else. He had sacrificed everything for an incredibly fickle, cutthroat media industry that rarely, if ever, guarantees long-term permanence to anyone. That tragic existential choice, he now quietly realizes, may have ultimately cost him far more than he ever anticipated losing in his twilight years. He has also begun to speak with refreshing, unvarnished honesty about the agonizing reality of being effectively disabled for over a consecutive year. He described the deep, burning humiliation of relying entirely on a revolving door of professional carers to perform basic daily physical tasks. This radical loss of physical independence has completely reshaped his foundational identity as a man who once commanded the attention of millions. Over the recent Christmas season, he made a point of publicly wishing Ruth absolute happiness during a highly visible appearance at a major industry awards event. Those simple, carefully delivered words were entirely deliberate, signaling to the public that he had no desire to diminish the beautiful decades they shared. Meanwhile, Ruth continues to undergo intensive psychological therapy, publicly stating that the professional guidance has kept her incredibly grounded through the chaos. She frequently celebrates her newfound independence and emotional strength on Loose Women, even hinting at a potential, triumphant return to daytime television hosting. They now permanently occupy two completely parallel, vastly different tracks as they navigate the remaining chapters of their highly publicized lives. He remains intensely focused on his complex physical recovery, exploring cutting-edge medical treatments in the faint hope that his mobility might improve. She remains fiercely focused on her emotional and professional rebuilding, embracing the single life with a sense of renewed vitality and purpose. At 66 years of age, Eamonn Holmes has ultimately chosen not to offer the public a sensationalized scandal or a series of bitter recriminations. Instead, he has offered the world something far rarer, far more uncomfortable, and infinitely more human: the quiet spectacle of profound, unresolvable regret. And as anyone who has ever loved and lost deeply knows, a quiet confession of regret always lands far harder than an angry accusation. It forces us to look past the sensationalized tabloid headlines and confront the fragile, broken reality of two human beings who simply ran out of time.